Of course, the path to success is going to be different for every musician, but after teaching hundreds of different musicians, I can tell you there is a macro framework that just about every musician follows to achieve success in music. So I define success in music as busting open the infinite creativity glitch. So this relates back to the key mechanism that you have to understand in order to bust open the infinite creativity glitch. That key mechanism is transcendental discipline. So think about it like this. Do you really think you'd be relying on discipline if you had eradicated all of your creative blockages and you had realized boundless creative awareness? No, you wouldn't be relying on discipline anymore. You would jump out of bed every morning excited to make the new discovery and ultimately turn the page on your development. It's a really good way to think about it. It's like when you're reading a book, does it take discipline to read the book if you're interested in it? No, you want to turn the page. You want to see what's next. You want that discovery. That's what transcendental discipline is, right? So it's really about knowing where to go, right? If you see the road ahead of you and you see the destination, you're drawn toward that destination. And you're not really relying on discipline to reach that destination because the excitement of getting to the destination makes you forget about all the steps you got to take in between. You just want to take the next step, take the next step, take the next step. And of course, you can see each step in itself is a destination, right? So there's this huge macro micro thing. Like each step does need to be enjoyable in a certain sense. And that is possible when you realize how each step is getting you to that ultimate goal, which is defined as busting open the infinite creativity glitch. So if you watch to the end of this video, you're gonna see exactly how you can bust open the infinite creativity glitch. I'm gonna explain how it works for me and how it works for my students so that you can start to see that goal clearly in your mind and then start taking the steps toward that goal. So it starts with mastering jazz. In every sense, jazz embodies musical fluency, right? So when you think of music like a language, it becomes clear that there's only one goal. It's to be fluent in that language, right? If you're not fluent in that language, well, then you're nowhere near busting open the infinite creativity glitch, obviously, because you got to understand that your language defines your reality. When you're fluent in English, you're aware of all of these concepts. For example, the word nostalgia, right? Like when somebody tells you what nostalgia means, it becomes that much more real to you. So language has this tendency to solidify your reality. It gives you confidence to think in a certain way because you're sort of following in the footsteps of those that have already thought these things. It's very similar in music, right? So jazz provides those footprints for you to follow. And through jazz, you start to become familiar with convention. So this is convention of chord progressions, convention of melody, convention of form. And because jazz is an improvisational music, it's just closer to that definition of fluency. Just like now in English, I'm basically just improvising in English, and that's really why I'm fluent. It's the same thing in jazz. Being able to improvise with those conventions is really the basis of fluency. So that's why the first step to busting open the infinite creativity glitch is to understand jazz and understand the conventions of music through the jazz standard framework. Because what you'll find is you can understand classical music, modern popular music, rock music, everything in between through the jazz standard framework. So you're basically cutting right to the chase of comprehensive musical awareness by just understanding jazz, right? So there's step one in this macro framework, become a master of jazz. Now, for those of you who think you gotta get a freaking master's degree and go to school for like 10 years to figure this out, that's just propaganda they sold you to get your tuition money. Really, you can master jazz in 6 months. Now, you're not gonna be Alan Holdsworth after 6 months, obviously, but you can completely understand the conventions of music through the jazz standard framework and be able to improvise coherently with confidence after a 6-month period. And I'm saying that because I've taught hundreds of people jazz mastery over a 6-month period. Now, to be fair, I probably have the most cutting edge methodology you'll find anywhere, but I just want to be clear, you do not need to spend a decade to crack the code in jazz, because jazz is not the be all end all. The be all end all, of course, is busting open the infinite creativity glitch. Jazz is just step one along that process. And we're talking about a 3-step process here. So let's talk about step 2. So step 2 is composition, of course. And composition weaves directly into your jazz practice, because when you first start practicing jazz, you are going to be relying on composition to develop your improvisational vocabulary in the beginning. But in jazz, you're composing with respect to a form that already exists, right? The jazz standards provide the form, and then you're composing melodies according to that form, right? So you're not 100% responsible for the composition. But here's the key: the forms in jazz, the convention of those forms, the convention of those compositions will inform your composition in step 2 of this process, right? That's why jazz, once again, it's so undeniably fundamental to musical mastery, because without studying the conventions, well, what gives you the right to make music? You know, I know millions of people could disagree with that statement, but I mean, maybe I'm just traditional, but I think that you need to be aware of the conventions that came before you start to create new conventions. It's hilarious how many comments I get that are like, well, what about Jimi Hendrix? He didn't know anything about music theory. Can we stop comparing ourselves to Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain in my comment sections? Like, it's like you're completely missing the point. You're trying to take the easy way out, and that's why you keep getting stuck in a rut. You don't have the awareness of convention to fall back on, right? See, this is the key. When you know all the tricks, right? When you know the conventions, the tricks, you literally just have the tools to complete all of your ideas. And you also have a reference for what a complete idea looks like. Right? That's why the form awareness, right? That's what jazz standard teaches us. They teach us what a complete composition can look like. And that's what makes that goal clear in your mind. You're like, oh, okay, so that's what a complete composition looks like. Now I just need to reverse engineer that. It really goes back to having that clear end goal in your mind. And that's gonna come from studying the conventions. All right, so on step 2, we are applying the things we learned in our jazz studies. We are applying these things to our own compositions. We are now creating forms. We are using ubiquitous or commonly occurring chord progressions in forms that we create. And we are beginning to realize that all of the harmonic sequences have already been done. So you're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. You're just trying to use the conventions to your own ends. So the mentality is realizing that the composition is not really complete until it's been arranged, right? And that's where step 3 comes in. So this is about to open up a whole wormhole right here, but I think I can explain it to you pretty quickly. So think about GOAT by Polyphia. I know I use that as a reference a lot because it embodies everything that I'm about to talk about. So GOAT, the chord progression of GOAT, is a 4-chord progression, okay? Like, it's so simple that it hurts. Like, you could never give Polyphia the credit for writing that chord progression. That chord progression existed hundreds of years before Polyphia used it. But then when you listen to GOAT, you hear an entirely new composition that sounds like nothing you've ever heard before. Why does it sound so unique, even if the chord progression used is hundreds of years old and has been used hundreds of times? It's because of how they arranged it. So this is that step 3 level, that arranging level. And step 3 full circles back to jazz mastery, because arranging is essentially applying the things that you learn in jazz mastery to create iconic melodies through ubiquitous forms, or forms that trigger a sense of nostalgia. And this is that convention level, right? So convention is triggering the nostalgia. So the reason why GOAT is literally an actual GOAT of a track is because that basic progression that they're using is triggering a sense of nostalgia, but then with the unique arrangement, with like the open string harmonics and like the cool chord voicings and the sick rhythms and all those things that they're using, that nostalgia is redefined through the arrangement. And there's your step 3 infinite creativity glitch. So do you see that step 3 and step 1 are almost exactly the same thing? Like, you're gonna get to a point where you don't see the difference between your original chord progressions and chord progressions that already existed, because you're just gonna arrange them in the same way regardless of if you wrote it or if you didn't write it, right? This just goes back to convention being the actual music theory. People are trying to understand music theory. It's way more important to understand convention. And that's of course understood by seeing all music through the jazz standard framework, right? Like being able to look at GOAT and see that it's basically just a jazz standard arranged within an inch of its life. Like there's no improvisation, they arranged the fuck out of it instead. But that arrangement came as a result of applying the principles of jazz in a compositional way, using a form that already existed, that you could take to the bank was gonna be great. And here's the kicker with GOAT, is literally a Coltrane sequence. I made that whole video about that. So to call that song GOAT, like, very deliberate title there. So it really comes back to this idea of seeing the simplicity in what I call the infinite creativity glitch, realizing that all of the harmonic sequences have been done before, right? So it's not about trying to come up with a new harmonic sequence. It's about leveraging the ubiquity of the harmonic sequences, leveraging the ubiquity of the conventions, and then arranging those into finer detail, almost approaching it like you're a jazz musician. But you can choose to either compose or improvise the arrangement, right? So jazz, generally you're improvising the arrangement, whereas Polyphia is composing the arrangement, but it's all the same principles, right? So that's the 3-step macro framework. I teach all 3 of these things in my school. Systems for Creation, first link in the description. So if you want to be a true master of music and bust open the infinite creativity glitch, I can tell you my school is going to be the best investment you ever made in your life, and I look forward to seeing you in there.